The sad fact is that we are living in a time where our once liberal societies are no longer liberal. We live in a deeply illiberal society that punishes people for openly expressing heretical thoughts. And that statement that I just made, that we live in an illiberal society, requires some justification. I mean, nominally, we have democracies with constitutions, charters, whatever, committed to essential civil liberties necessary for a liberal society. And I admit, before the pandemic, I took these rights for granted. I took the right to free speech for granted, the right to worship, the right to protest, the right to free movement across borders. But during the pandemic, what I learned was that the government could violate each of every one of these rights, and in the name of infection control. During the pandemic, governments made it nearly impossible for independent scientists to discuss and disseminate ideas contrary to government public health policy. Government censored, smeared, and defamed dissident scientists who criticized government authorities in the name of science. And I say this from firsthand experience. What I want to do today is I want to tell you the mechanisms by which the government accomplished this amazing feat of silencing scientists. The way that they did this, I learned, the US government, I learned, violated my free speech rights and those of my scientist colleagues for questioning federal government COVID policies. The American government, working in concert with big tech companies, defamed and suppressed me and my colleagues for criticizing official pandemic policies, a criticism that's proved to be prescient. And while this may sound like a conspiracy theory, in fact, it's a documented fact. And it's one recently confirmed in a federal circuit court. So the main reason I was so looking forward to talking to you is to tell you about my experience with this court case, which has absolutely blown the lid off of the mechanisms by which the government suppressed speech. In August of 2022, the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's offices in the United States asked me to join as a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Biden administration. The suit, it's still ongoing, aims to end the government's role in censorship and restore free speech rights. The lawyers in this case, this Missouri versus Biden case, took sworn depositions from many federal officials involved in the censorship effort, including Tony Fauci. I highly recommend, if you have time, to go look at the 8-hour deposition that he gave to the lawyers, where he could not recall basic scientific facts. In fact, he said, I don't recall 179 times in 8 hours. It's great, amusing listening if you have a few moments to hear somebody who set the narrative tell you that he doesn't recall the scientific basis on which he said it. The legal discovery also unearthed email exchanges between the government and social media companies. The content of these emails were absolutely shocking. It showed an administration willing to threaten and use regulatory power to harm social media companies that did not comply with censorship demands. The case revealed that a dozen federal agencies, and this includes the Surgeon General's office, the US CDC, the FBI, the State Department, they pressured Google, Facebook, Twitter to censor and suppress speech contradicting federal pandemic priorities. If you ever had any post on Google, on Twitter or on Facebook suppressed, it may very well have been as a result of the demands by the US federal government that speech that contradicted its policies be censored. In the name of suppressing misinformation, the government forced the social media companies to suppress true facts. This included facts relating to the evidence for immunity after COVID recovery, the inefficacy and damage of mask mandates, and the inability of the vaccine to stop disease transmission. True or false, if the speech interfered with government priorities, it had to go. And it didn't matter if you had credentials, it didn't matter if you had facts or papers on your side, your speech would be labeled as misinformation or would be taken off the platform altogether. And the threats were severe. Essentially, what the government told the social media companies is that if they didn't suppress speech, then the government would go after the social media companies using regulatory powers. The one judge writing about this evidentiary records analogized it to a mob attack. So someone like Al Capone going to a company and saying, "Well, that's a nice company you have there. Wouldn't it be terrible if something were to happen to it?" And of course, social media companies complied. They like to have their companies run, and so they silenced a tremendous number of people, including scientists, to suppress speech. Now, I want to talk for a moment about the mechanism by which modern censorship actually works. It's not just by removing speech. I mean, the internet is such that you will be able to hear speech even if the government wants to censor it. The key mechanism is by essentially labeling scientists, labeling people, labeling ideas as outside the bounds, essentially excommunicating heretics by labeling ideas too dangerous to even think or speak, even if they're true. The government uses social media companies essentially to set the bounds for discussion. And if you disagree, you're a dissident, you're a heretic, you're going to be smeared as a misinformation artist. Okay, so that's the bad news, that we have governments around the world, especially the American government, working to suppress speech in this way. But on July 4th of this year, the US Federal District Court Judge Terry Doughty issued a preliminary injunction in this case, ordering the government to immediately stop coercing social media companies. In the decision, Doughty called the administration's censorship infrastructure an Orwellian ministry of truth. He wrote this in a federal ruling. And on August, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed the Biden administration had indeed strong-armed social media companies into doing its bidding. The court found that the Biden administration, the CDC, the Surgeon General's office, the White House itself had engaged in a years-long pressure campaign on social media outlets designed to ensure that the censorship aligned with the government's preferred viewpoints. Now I'm going to spend a couple of minutes, and I heard you all cheer the Great Barrington Declaration. I'm so grateful for every one of you that signed it. Thank you. I'll tell you, as a result of your signing it, you put yourself at some critical risk. What they wanted censored was ideas like the Great Barrington Declaration. The trouble began on October 4th, 2020, when my colleagues and I, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, a professor of medicine at Harvard, and Dr. Sunetra Gupta, an epidemiologist at the University of Oxford, Carl Hennigan's colleague, published the Great Barrington Declaration. We called for an end to economic lockdowns, to school shutdowns, and to other restrictive policies because, well, I mean, I don't need to tell you, they harm the poor, they harm children, they harm the economically disadvantaged, they harm the working class while conferring limited benefits. It called for focused protection, for strong measures to protect high-risk populations, especially the elderly. We spent trillions. Why not spend it protecting people at high risk? And then calling for low-risk people to return to normal life. Tens of thousands of doctors, public health scientists signed on. Julia mentioned Sweden. There's this country that apparently no one remembers in the northern part of Europe. And Sweden, which didn't have lockdowns, after early problems, embraced focused protection. They had among the lowest all-cause excess deaths, age-adjusted, than every other country in Europe, including the UK, including the United States, including Germany, including Finland, including Norway. And they suffered none of the learning loss for elementary school kids because they kept schools open for kids under 16 through the entire pandemic. In the United States, Florida, which followed a much more reasonable policy compared to much of the rest of the US, especially places like where I live in California, Florida has had lower all-cause excess deaths than California since the start of the pandemic. It turns out that civil liberties are good for your health. That in fact, though you were told that we needed to lock down, we needed to comply, we needed to deal with free speech orders, no, all of those were actually worse and bad for your health had we just simply followed a liberal society's commitments to free speech and other civil liberties, we would have had better health outcomes. And that in Florida, California comparison and the Swedish comparison makes that very clear. So the government, what they wanted to suppress was the fact that there were prominent scientists who opposed lockdowns and had alternate ideas, like the Great Barrington Declaration. They wanted to maintain an illusion of consensus in favor of lockdowns. It's impossible for me to speculate what might have happened if we had a more typical scientific spirit. Without censorship, we would have won the debate and the world would have moved along with a different and better path these last 3.5 years. Censorship is the death of science. It inevitably leads to the death of people. The US and the UK should have been a bulwark against it, but it wasn't during the pandemic. The tide is turning with cases like Missouri versus Biden, which is now sitting at the Supreme Court. But we have to reform our scientific institutions so that what happened during the pandemic never happens again. And in every formerly liberal countries, governments that suppressed speech, well, we have to work together to stop them, both at the judiciary and at the ballot box. Thank you for letting me